Okay, here's the book. It's called the How Not to Study a Disease, the Story of Alzheimer's. The author's name is Karl Herrup. He's an Alzheimer's researcher. I think he's currently at University of Pittsburgh or something. So here's the book, How Not to Study the Disease. And I'm going to tell you something. It's a funny book. If you understand it, it's really a comic book. So it's 250 pages. And he basically just says the same thing over and over again. He says that Alzheimer's has become a disaster, a joke of a field. Basically, they don't even know the definition of Alzheimer's. I've told you before, Alzheimer's is fake. It's like a unicorn. It's a joke. All right, so why do I say that? They had the original diagnosis of Alzheimer's, about 100 years ago, and they looked in the brain of the lady and the farmer's wife in Germany, and they said, oh, gee, she's got these senile plaques. That's what it is. And then they extrapolated from the idea of familial Alzheimer's to everybody, senile dementia being Alzheimer's. And why did that all happen? The reason is there's research foundations that want more money. It's always about money quite often. They want more money. So if you're a research foundation, the more you can convince everybody that all of dementia is Alzheimer's, then you can say, well, look, we're researching the most important problem. Therefore, we need more money. We need more money. So the more these spokespeople went around saying that dementia is almost entirely Alzheimer's, it's the most common cause of dementia, then they could get all this money. And then they had to define it. They said, well, let's just define it based on the pathology. But that's insane. Defining it on something that you could only check when the person's dead. Okay, a patient doesn't go to the hospital hoping that when they die, they've got such and such a diagnosis. And they want to live. They want to be healthy. It's entirely stupid. And then there was big arguments in all the research communities about how we're going to define it. And the people who had the most control had it defined as what you see at autopsy. And then it gets even funnier than that because they find at autopsy lots of so-called normal people have the pathology, the microscopic examination to match what fits for Alzheimer's. And a lot of what they called Alzheimer's during life don't have it. So they can't even diagnose it as death. That's why I'm telling you, Alzheimer's is a joke. You can't diagnose it by historical question, meaning you can't ask the patient a question and know they have Alzheimer's. You can't put a stethoscope on them and confirm they have Alzheimer's by physical exam findings. There's no reliable blood test to confidently diagnose Alzheimer's. The imaging tests are unreliable. They'll say parietal temporal atrophy, but I almost never see that. I've seen many thousands and thousands and thousands of brains for cognitive decline and dementia. Okay, then they'll say, well, you can do nuclear medicine tests for amyloid, but that's still not that reliable. And then they'll say, well, autopsy. Well, that's not that reliable either. And so it's a bit of a joke. And then they had the Notre Dame nun, Mankato, Minnesota, cognitive reserve theory. The nuns that were more scholarly, they're less likely to get so-called Alzheimer's dementia, because they have cognitive reserve, and therefore they can tolerate more senile plaques and whatnot before they get it as a like ex post facto way to justify why pathology diagnosis isn't even reliable, because those people had more cognitive reserve. That's why they had, senile plaques, extracellular, neurofibrillary tangles, intracellular, but they didn't have clinical presentation of Alzheimer's because they had cognitive reserve. So what I'm saying is the more you look at it, the stupider it gets. So you've got hundreds and hundreds of these Alzheimer's scientists all over the place. They spend billions and billions of dollars on them, and they can't find anything useful. They've got no useful treatment whatsoever. So what would you call a disease? You can't diagnose it while the patient's alive. You can't diagnose it at autopsy when the patient's dead. And you have no treatment for it. You would call that BS. That's what it is. It's nonsense. And that's what I'm telling you. I've told you before, the only thing that could save healthcare and medicine is to go back to a Bible-based view that man is created in the image of God. Therefore, we must tell the truth. Because if you don't have that, all that you get is lying all day long, lying and nonsense, and people fighting over money. And it becomes a joke. It all becomes a joke. That's what I'm saying is you could spend $500 billion on Alzheimer's. You would never discover anything useful because all they're going to do is fight over the money and play games. All right? Anyways, and that's why I also tell you, Watson and Crick, just studying on their own, they figured out, the structure of DNA. And that's kind of how it works. You'll notice that it's a couple of individuals that want to tell the truth and figure out the truth. They're the one that tell you what's going on. That's why McDougall, this Irish guy from Podunk in the middle of nowhere figures out all this useful stuff about nutrition because he wanted to figure out the truth and tell the truth. And then what's also funny is these guys claim to be so high and mighty, and he's actually being a lot more moral than 99% of Alzheimer's researchers. He tells you the truth. We don't have a diagnosis. We don't even know what we're talking about. Our whole field is a joke. He tells you the truth. Okay, so I'll give him credit for that. That was a very brave thing to do. He's going to make a lot of enemies in this field. He's an old guy, though, so he's got his tenure probably, and he's going to retire soon probably. He looks like he's a ready to retire old guy. So he a lot of the times the legacy books of these old scientists are the best one. What I'm trying to tell you, though, is the public is so clueless. The public thinks there's all these research institutions and they're working to solve the disease and hopefully they'll have it figured out soon and they can help me. No, BS. They're never going to figure out anything. And you know why? It's rather obvious. Imagine you're a research foundation dedicated to finding a cure for Alzheimer's. Do you think they actually want to find a cure for Alzheimer's? Of course not. What would happen if they found a cure? There would be no need to give them millions or billions of dollars every year anymore. So they never are going to find it. They don't want to find it. All they have to do is say, we're working on it, we're getting closer. The whole thing is nonsense. It's a con game, okay? And these con artist games, they happen at the biggest levels, at the highest level, okay? The higher people are up in the system, the more they recognize what an opportunity it is to just loot money, okay? So that is, I think, rather funny. The best universities in the world, and all they can do with billions and billions and billions of dollars is find nothing, okay? But one smart person, I like this Galileo quote. In the sciences, the authority of thousands of opinions is not worth as much as one tiny spark of reason in an individual man. If reasoning were like pulling rocks, then several reasoners might be better than one. But reasoning is like a horse race where one stallion easily outruns 100 plow horses. Okay? And people say, oh, I'm being mean or I'm being cocky. No, BS. It's obvious. Take a look at Jack Delatorre. He's a PhD guy out in Texas who figured out the mouse equivalent theory, the vascular hypothesis of dementia. They never mention him in this book. They'll never mention him in all these Ivy League books I have on Alzheimer's. He's not in any of the textbooks. Just like in the nutrition books, they'll never mention McDougall, Kempner, Pritikin, and all the great ones. They won't do it. T. Colin Campbell, Esselstyn, they won't do it. Okay, and so what I'm trying to say is you see the same thing in the neurology research here. There's no mention of Tetsumori Yamashima and his Calpain-Cathepsin theory. No mention of Jack Delatorre and his vascular hypothesis of dementia, mouse equivalent theory. There's no mention of Douglas Kelly and Theresia Pretorius and their concept of amyloidogenic clotting and that's relationship to the brain. No mention of Roy Swank and what he taught us about the blood-brain barrier and tissue hypoxia and autoimmune disease and brain damage. No mention of Olney, Exley, Choi, Mattson, Russell, and other ones. No mention of Sloop and atherosclerosis research or Richard Moore and his hypertension research. All of these things destroy the brain and make people demented, okay? These are the people that everyone should know about if they're going to study the brain. And that's why I'm telling you these books are a joke, okay? They really are. Trust me, these books are like writing about basketball but not talking about dribbling. They'd be like writing books about baseball and not talking about pitching and catching. They're stupid, okay? And they should be called stupid, okay? So anyways, that's what it's all about. That nobody wants to cure the disease. And it was funny, Pritikin used to joke that the American Diabetic Association diet was designed to make sure the patient never recovers from diabetes. And so what I'm saying is by making sure that you're only allowed to get funding to research Alzheimer's, so-called Alzheimer's dementia, meaning all dementia, was if you focus on studying the amyloid cascade hypothesis, but the amyloid cascade hypothesis itself is bogus, so it doesn't matter what you do. You could handle amyloid cascade hypothesis from 1,000 different ways, which has been done, and you get nothing. You could, create medications, which they have done, that get rid of all the amyloid, but the patient's still not improved. It's a joke. I'm trying to teach you this is all a joke, because you need to realize that all this research is a joke, and that $100 billion means nothing because it's always going to be a joke. It doesn't matter how much money you spend on it. And that's why I say you have to love the patient. You have to say man is created in the image of God, part divine, therefore we will do right by him. The truth and the value of the individual has to be above the money, otherwise nothing is accomplished. Okay, look at cancer research, the so-called war on cancer since the early 1970s. What have they accomplished? Next to nothing. Okay, they still won't allow the metabolic theory to be taught, but that's the better theory. Okay, and the theory is essential because the theory determines what you do in all your research. So if you have a lousy somatic mutation theory, you can't figure out anything useful about cancer. If you're trapped into the amyloid cascade hypothesis, you can't figure out anything useful about dementia. This is also why, individuals from podunk figure out more about dementia and cancer and other things than all of these multi-billion-dollar funded research universities that are just a joke. They're like clown school, nonsense factories. So anyways, the book is rather funny. He just basically sort of keeps whining. We don't know what we're doing. We don't have a definition. Our research is going nowhere. The amyloid cascade hypothesis, treatments, and research fails over and over again. We haven't made any progress. Yeah, it's funny. He's telling the truth in his own way, but he's got a very narrow way of looking at things because he's a researcher. He hasn't read widely about the brain to see all these perspectives, you know. So for me, talking about the brain without talking about excitotoxicity, phosphatidylserine, microglia. He did mention microglia briefly, but a very sort of superficial, cursory look at it all. No mention of nutrition in any type of sophisticated way. So what I'm trying to say is you could read all the big university, Ivy League books, etc., and you'll never get past baby talk. I'm telling you. That's why I'm so confident. Because I know what these guys know, and they don't know much.